The Wendigo. A wealthy man wanted to go hunting in a part of northern Canada where few people had ever hunted. He traveled to a trading post and tried to find a guide to take him, but no one would do it. It was too dangerous, they said. Finally, he found an Indian who needed money badly, and he agreed to take him. The Indian's name was Defago. They made camp in the snow near a large frozen lake. For 3 days they hunted, but they had nothing to show for it. The third night, a windstorm came up. They lay in their tent, listening to the wind howling and the trees whipping back and forth. To see the storm better, the hunter opened the tent flap. What he saw startled him. There wasn't a breath of air stirring, and the trees were standing perfectly still. Yet he could hear the wind howling, and the more he listened, the more it sounded as if it were calling Defago's name. Defago, it called. Defago. I must be losing my mind, the hunter thought. But Defago had gotten out of his sleeping bag. He was huddled in the corner of the tent, his head buried in his arms. "What's this all about?" the hunter asked. "It's nothing," Defago said. But the wind continued to call to him, and Defago became more tense and more restless. Defago, it called. Defago. Suddenly, he jumped to his feet, and he began to run from the tent. But the hunter grabbed him and wrestled him to the ground. "You can't leave me out here," the hunter shouted. Then the wind called again, and Defago broke loose and ran into the darkness. The hunter could hear him screaming as he went. Again and again he cried, "Oh, my fiery feet, my burning feet of fire!" Then his voice faded away, and the wind died down. At daybreak, the hunter followed Defago's tracks in the snow. They went through the woods, down toward the lake, then out onto the ice. But soon he noticed something strange. The steps Defago had taken had gotten longer and longer. They were so long, no human being could have taken them. It was as if something had helped him to hurry away. The hunter followed the tracks out to the middle of the lake, but there they disappeared. At first, he thought that Defago had fallen through the ice, but there wasn't any hole. Then he thought that something had pulled him off the ice into the sky, but that made no sense. As he stood wondering what had happened, the wind picked up again. Soon it was howling as it had the night before. Then he heard Defago's voice. It was coming from up above, and again he heard Defago screaming, "My fiery feet! My burning feet!" But there was nothing to be seen. Now the hunter wanted to leave that place as fast as he could. He went back to the camp and packed. Then he left some food for Defago, and he started out. Weeks later, he reached civilization. The following year, he went back to hunt in that area again. He went to the same trading post to look for a guide. The people there could not explain what had happened to Defago that night, but they had not seen him since then. "Maybe it was the Wendigo," one of them said, and he laughed. "It's supposed to come with the wind. It drags you along at great speed until your feet are burned away, and more of you than that. Then it carries you into the sky, and it drops you. It's just a crazy story, but that's what some of the Indians say." A few days later, the hunter was at the trading post again. An Indian came in and sat by the fire. He had a blanket wrapped around him, and he wore his hat so that you couldn't see his face. The hunter thought there was something familiar about him. He walked over and he asked, "Are you DeFago?" The Indian didn't answer. "Do you know anything about him?" No answer. He began to wonder if something was wrong, if the man needed help, but he couldn't see his face. "Are you all right?" he asked. No answer. To get a look at him, he lifted the Indian's hat. Then he screamed. There was nothing under the hat but a pile of ashes. The Hollow Man. 4. Yes, that's how many there were. Come to my home. Come to my home in the hills. Come in the middle of feast, when the skin had been peeled back and I was ready to sup. Interrupting, disrupting, stealing the comfortable bloat of a full belly, the black scent of clean bones burning dry on glowing embers. 4. Yes, that's how many there were. I watched them through the stretched skin window, saw them standing cold in the snow with their guns at their sides. The Hollow Man saw them too. He heard the ice dogs bark and raised his sunken face, peering at the men through the blue-veined window. He gasped, expectant, and I had to draw my claws from their fleshy sheaths and jab deep into his blackened muscles to keep him from saying words that weren't mine. Outside, they shouted, "Hello, hello, hello, in the cabin!" And the Hollow Man sprang for the door. I jumped on his back and tugged the metal rings pinned into his neck. He jerked and whirled away from the latch, but I was left with the sickening sound of his hopeful moans. Once again, control was mine, but not like before. The Hollow Man was full of strength that he hadn't possessed in weeks, and the feast was ruined. They had ruined it. "Hello! We're tired and need food!" The Hollow Man strained forward, his fingers groping for the door latch. My scaled legs flexed hard around his middle. His sweaty stomach sizzled, and he cried at the heat of me. A rib snapped. Another. He sank backward. And, with a dry flutter of wings, I pulled him away from the window, back into the dark. "Could we share your fire? It's so damn cold!" "We'd give you money, but we ain't got any. There ain't a nickel within 1,000 miles of here." Small screams tore the lips of the Hollow Man. There was blood. I cursed the waste and twisted a handful of metal rings. He sank to his knees and quieted. "We'll leave our guns. We don't mean no harm." I jerked one ring, then another. I cooed against the Hollow Man's skinless shoulder and made him pick up his rifle. When he had loaded it, cocked, and aimed through a slot in the door, I whispered in his ear and made him laugh. And then I screamed out at them. "You dirty bastards! You stay away! You ain't coming in here!" Gunshots exploded. We only got one of them, not clean but bad enough. The others pulled him into the forest, where the dense trees muffled his screams and kept us from getting another clear shot. The rifle clattered to the floor, smoking faintly, smelling good. We walked to the window. I jingled his neck rings, and the Hollow Man squinted through the tangle of veins to the spot where a red streak was freezing in the snow. I made the Hollow Man smile. So 4. Still 4, when night came and moonlight dripped like melting wax over the snow-capped ridges to the west. 4 to make me forget the one nearly drained. 4 to make me impatient while soft time crept toward the leaden hour, grain by grain, breath by breath. The hour descended. I twisted rings and plucked black muscles, and the hollow man fed the fire and barred the door. I released him, and he huddled in a corner, exhausted. I rose through the chimney and thrust myself away from the cabin. My wings fought the biting wind as I climbed high, searching the black forest below. I soared the length of a high mountain glacier and dove away, banking back toward the heart of the valley. Shadows that stretched forever, and then, deep in a jagged ravine that stabbed at a river, a sputtered glimmer of orange. A campfire. So bold. So typical of their kind. I extended my wings and drifted down like a bat, coming to rest in the branches of a giant redwood. Its live green stench nearly made me retch. Huddling in my wings for warmth, I clawed through the bark with a wish to make the ancient monster scream. The tree quivered against the icy wind. Grinning, satisfied, I looked down. Two strong, but different. One weak. One as good as dead. 3. Grizzly sat in silence, his black face as motionless as a tombstone. Instantly I liked him the best. Mammoth, wrapped in a bristling grizzly coat, he looked even bigger, almost as big as a grizzly. He sat by the fire, staring at his reflection in a gleaming axe blade. He made me anxious. He could last for months. Across from Grizzly, Redbeard turned a pot and boiled coffee. He straightened his fox head cap and stroked his beard, clearing it of ice. I didn't like him. His milky squint was too much like my own. But any fool could see that he hated Grizzly, and that made me smile. Away from them both, crouching under a tree with the whimpering ice dogs, Rabbit wept through swollen eyes. He dug deep in his plastic coat and produced a crucifix. I almost laughed out loud. And, in a tent, wrapped in a sweat-damp wool and expensive eiderdown that couldn't keep him warm anymore, still clinging to life, was the dead man, who didn't matter. But maybe I could make him matter. And then there would only be 2. When the clouds came, when they suffocated the unblinking moon and brought sleep to the camp, I crept down to the dying fire and rolled comfortably in the crab-colored coals. The hush of the river crept over me as I decided what to do. To make 3 into 2. 3 men, 1 dead man. 2 tents. Grizzly and Redbeard in one, and Rabbit and the dead man in the other. Easy. No worries except the dogs. For ice dogs are wise. Their beast hearts hide simple secrets. The packed snow sizzled beneath my feet as I crept toward Rabbit's tent. The dead man's face pressed against one corner of the tent, molding his swollen features in yellow plastic. Each rattling breath gently puffed the thin material away from his face, and each weak gasp slowly drew it back. It was a steady, pleasant sound. I concentrated on it until it was mine. No time for metal rings. No time for naked muscle and feast. Slowly, I reached out and took a hold of Rabbit's mind, digging deep until I found his darkest nightmare. I pulled it loose and let it breathe. At first, it frightened him. But I tugged its midnight corners straight and banished its monsters, and soon Rabbit was full of bliss, awake without even knowing it. I circled the tent and pushed against the other side. The dead man rolled across, cold against the warmth of Rabbit's unbridled nightmare. "Jesus, you're freezing, Charlie," whispered Rabbit as he moved closer. "But don't worry. I'll keep you warm, buddy. I've got to keep you warm." But in the safety of his nightmare, that wasn't what Rabbit wanted at all. I waited in the tree until Grizzly found them the next morning, wrapped together in the dead man's bag. He shot Rabbit in the head and left him for the ice dogs. Redbeard buried the dead man in a silky snowdrift. That day was nothing. Grizzly and Redbeard sat at the edge of the clearing and wasted their only chance. Grizzly stared hungrily at the cabin, seeing only what I wanted him to see. Thick, safe walls, a puffing chimney, a home. But Redbeard, damned Redbeard, wise with fear and full of caution, sensed other things. The dead man's fevered rattle whispering through the trees, an ice dog gnawing a fresh, grisly bone, and bear traps, rusty with blood. Redbeard rose and walked away. Soon Grizzly followed, and then there was only the Hollow Man, rocking gently in his chair. The soles of his boots buffed the splintery floor, and his legs swung back and forth, back and forth. 2, now 2, as the second night was born, a silent twin to the first. Only 2, as again I twisted rings and plucked muscles and put the Hollow Man to sleep. Just 2, as my wings beat the night and I flew once more from the sooty chimney to the ravine that stabbed the river. There they sat, as before, Grizzly and Fox, and there I watched, waiting, with nothing left to do but listen for the sweet arrival of the leaden hour. Grizzly chopped wood and fed the fire. Redbeard positioned blackened pots and watched them boil. Both planned silently while they ate, and afterwards their mute desperation grew, knotting their minds into coils of anger. Grizzly charged the dying embers with whole branches and did not smile until the flames leapt wildly. The heat slapped at Redbeard in waves, harsh against the pleasant brandy warmth that swam in his gut and slowed his racing thoughts. "Tomorrow morning," blurted Redbeard, "we're getting away from here. I'm not dealing with no crazy hermit." Grizzly stared at his axe-blade reflection and smiled. "We're gonna kill us a crazy hermit," he said, "tomorrow morning." Soon enough the old words came, taut and cold, and then Grizzly sprang through the leaping flames, his black coat billowing, and Redbeard's fox-head cap flew from his head as he whirled around. Axe rang against knife. A white fist tore open a black lip, and the teeth below ripped into a pale knuckle. Knife split ebony cheek. Blood hissed through flames and sizzled through burning embers. A sharp crack as the axe sank home in a tangle of ribs. Redbeard coughed a misty breath past Grizzly's ear, and the bigger man spun the smaller around, freed his axe, and watched his opponent stumble into the fire. I laughed above the crackling roar. The ice dog scattered into the forest, barking, wild with fear and the sour smell of death. So Grizzly had survived. He stood still, his singed coat smoking, his cut cheek oozing blood. His mind was empty. There was no remorse, only a feeling that he was the strongest, he was the best. Knowing that, I flew home happy. There was not much in the cabin that I could use. I found only a single whalebone needle, yellow with age, and no thread at all. I watched the veined window as I searched impatiently for a substitute, and at last I discovered a spool of fishing line in a rusty metal box. Humming, I went about my work. First I drew strips of the Hollow Man's pallid skin over his shrunken shoulder muscles, fastening them along his backbone with a cross-stitch. Then I bunched the flabby tissue at the base of his skull and made the final secret passes with my needle. Now he was nothing. I tore the metal rings out of his neck, and the Hollow Man twitched as if shocked. A bullet ripped through the cabin door. "I'm gonna get you, you bastard!" cried Grizzly, his voice loud but worn. "You hear me? I'm gonna get you!" The hollow man sprang from the rocker. His withered legs betrayed him and he fell to the floor. I balanced on the back of the chair and hissed at him, spreading my wings in mock menace. With a laughable scream, he flung himself at the door. Grizzly must have been confused by the hollow man's ravings, for he didn't fire again until the fool was nearly upon him. An instant of pain, another of relief, and the hollow man crumpled, finished. And then Grizzly just sat in the snow, his eyes fixed on the open cabin door. I watched him from a corner of the veined window, afraid to move. He took out his axe and stared at his reflection in the glistening blade. After a time, Grizzly pocketed the axe. Then he pulled his great coat around him, disappearing into its bristling black folds. In the afternoon I grew fearful. While the redwoods stretched their heavy shadows over the cabin, Grizzly rose and followed the waning sun up a slight ridge. He cleaned his gun. He even slept a few moments. Then he slapped his numb face awake and rubbed snow over his sliced cheek. Grizzly came home. I hid above the doorway. Grizzly sighed as he crossed the threshold, and I bit back my laughter. The door swung shut. Grizzly stooped and tossed a thick log into the dying embers. He grinned as it crackled a flame. I pushed off hard and dove from the ceiling. My claws ripped through grizzly hide and then into human hide. Grizzly bucked awfully, even tried to smash me against the hearth, but the heat only gave me power, and as my legs burned into his stomach, Grizzly screamed. I drove my claws into a shivering bulge of muscle and brought him to his knees. The metal rings came next. I pinned them into his neck. 1, 2, 3, 4. After I had supped, I sat the hollow man in the rocker and whispered to him as we looked through the veined window. A storm was rising in the west. We watched it come for a long time. Soon, a fresh dusting of snow covered the husk of a man laying out on the ridge. I told Grizzly that he had been my favorite. I told him that he would last a long time. Harold. When it got hot in the valley, Thomas and Alfred drove their cows up to a cool, green pasture in the mountains to graze. Usually they stayed there with the cows for 2 months. Then they brought them down to the valley again. The work was easy enough, but oh, was it boring. All day the 2 men tended their cows. At night, they went back to the tiny hut where they lived. They ate supper and worked in the garden and went to sleep. It was always the same. Then Thomas had an idea that changed everything. "Let's make a doll the size of a man," he said. "It would be fun to make, and we could put it in the garden to scare away the birds." "It should look like Harold," Alfred said. Harold was a farmer they both hated. They made the doll out of old sacks stuffed with straw. They gave it a pointy nose like Harold's and tiny eyes like his. They added dark hair and a twisted frown. Of course, they also gave it Harold's name. Each morning on their way to the pasture, they tied Harold to a pole in the garden to scare away the birds. Each night, they brought him inside so that he wouldn't get ruined if it rained. When they were feeling playful, they would talk to him. One of them might say, "How are the vegetables growing today, Harold?" Then the other, making believe he was Harold, would answer in a crazy voice, "Very slowly." They would both laugh, but not Harold. Whenever something went wrong, they took it out on Harold. They would curse at him, even kick him or punch him. Sometimes one of them would take the food they were eating, which they were both sick of, and smear it on the doll's face. "How do you like that stew, Harold?" he would ask. "Well, you better eat it, or else." Then the 2 men would howl with laughter. One night, after Thomas had wiped Harold's face with food, Harold grunted. Did you hear that? Alfred asked. It was Harold, Thomas said. I was watching him when it happened. I can't believe it. How could he grunt? Alfred asked. He's just a sack of straw. It's not possible. Let's throw him in the fire, said Thomas, and that will be that. Let's not do anything stupid, said Alfred. We don't know what's going on. When we move the cows down, we'll leave him behind. For now, let's just keep an eye on him. So they left Harold sitting in a corner of the hut. They didn't talk to him or take him outside anymore. Now and then the doll grunted, but that was all. After a few days, they decided there was nothing to be afraid of. Maybe a mouse or some insects had gotten inside Harold and were making those sounds. So Thomas and Alfred went back to their old ways. Each morning they put Harold out in the garden, and each night they brought him back into the hut. When they felt playful, they joked with him. When they felt mean, they treated him as badly as ever. Then one night, Alfred noticed something that frightened him. Harold is growing, he said. I was just thinking the same thing, Thomas said. Maybe it's just our imagination, Alfred replied. We've been up here on this mountain for too long. The next morning, while they were eating, Harold stood up and walked out of the hut. He climbed up on the roof and trotted back and forth like a horse on its hind legs. All day and all night he trotted like that. In the morning, Harold climbed down and stood in a far corner of the pasture. The men had no idea what he would do next. They were afraid. They decided to take the cows down into the valley that same day. When they left, Harold was nowhere in sight. They felt as if they had escaped a great danger and began joking and singing. But when they had gone only a mile or two, they realized they had forgotten to bring the milking stools. Neither one wanted to go back for them, but the stools would cost a lot to replace. There really is nothing to be afraid of, they told one another. After all, what could a doll do? They drew straws to see which one would go back. It was Thomas. I'll catch up with you, he said, and Alfred walked on toward the valley. When Alfred came to a rise in the path, he looked back for Thomas, but he didn't see him. He did see Harold, however. The doll was on the roof of the hut again, and as Alfred watched, Harold kneeled and stretched out a bloody skin to dry in the sun.